terrorism, murder, rape, torture, enslavement, acts of terror that are now looked down upon as outright inhumane. However, these were a reality, an everyday occurrence for the Africans and poor whites during the Civil Rights era. In modern-day society, you would be thrown behind bars almost immediately for committing a crime anywhere near as bad as this. And yet the whites ran every aspect of these communities and were able to get away with inflicting such pain upon these poor people, ultimately displaying much injustice and superiority. The blacks and poor whites were inferior to the white man in every way. They were stripped of life necessities such as a good education, fair employment opportunities, and the right to vote for their own leaders. The blacks were further oppressed and restricted with unjust laws such as the grandfather clause, in which a black man could only vote if his grandfather had also voted. This was even more ridiculous, as these blacks were the first generation to live in America. Secondly, the convict lease system meant that black prisoners could be sold to private parties to perform manual labour that no whites wanted to do. And finally, sharecropping forced black farmers to give a white man half of his year's crop, as well as paying a large debt in order to use his land. These issues were only made worse by the constant harassment of the infamous Ku Klux Klan, who performed many vile and inhumane activities such as hanging, raping, abusing and murdering blacks. There was also the powerful and biased government parties of the Southern American states who fought to keep these helpless black men as their slaves. These parties were held supreme power over the blacks, as they were made up of all whites, of which many were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Nowadays, there are many forms of media that pay homage to and reflect on the tragic events of the Civil Rights era. Two prominent examples are the song All of the Places We've Been by Gil Scott-Heron and the 2001 film Remember the Titans. Both of these texts explore the mindsets and emotions of the African Americans during the pre-Civil Rights era and the post-Civil Rights era, respectively. During this podcast, we will explore how these texts add a voice and give new meaning to the events of this terrible time in history.
In my lifetime, I've been in towns where there was no freedom or a future around. I've been in places where you could not eat or take a drink of water wherever you please. And now that
these evocative lyrics open the song All of the Places We've Been by the legendary Gil Scott-Heron. They perfectly encapsulate the struggles of the black community during apartheid and the Civil Rights era. The song contains many lyrics that paint a clear and yet disturbing image of the pain that the blacks had to face during these truly trying times. Apartheid had forced these people onto their knees, placing restrictions on their opportunities, stripping them of life necessities, and ultimately taking away their humanity. And yet through all of this negativity, Gil Scott-Heron strives to display the hope, inspiration, and optimism that the African Americans withheld through this grueling time. This strength and optimism is implied when Gil Scott-Heron sings.
I'm not too happy about the middle of a mountain, so soon I'll be climbing again.
This is representative of the fact that the blacks felt that they were only halfway to their goal of equal rights, and they weren't going to give up now, and instead are going to keep on fighting. Gil Scott-Heron also pays tribute to the many black freedom fighters who had previously helped to progress the race's efforts forward and to get to the middle of the mountain. This is shown in the lyrics.
Please don't this mountain with a rare chance to see dreams once envisioned by folks much braver than me. And since their lives got
This speaks to the people who were fighting for the same cause, and all the pain they went through to get their voice heard in a time when the voices and ideas of blacks were muted. The black race felt empowered by leaders like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. because of the inspiration and optimism they always displayed. The song is best summed up in its recurring theme.
and all I can think of are the chapters and the scenes of all of the places we've been.
This is a reference to the overall struggle of the African Americans and the many stories that made up this horrifying time in human history. Directed by Boaz Yakin and based on a screenplay by Gregory Howard, the film Remember the Titans examines the challenges that both the blacks and whites had to face in the immediate aftermath of the civil rights era. Many new and unexpected challenges arose as the African Americans began to integrate themselves into the white society. Both races found it difficult to overcome stereotypes and dismantle racism. The film cinematically portrayed the emotional struggles of the blacks and whites during desegregation in many ways, predominantly by analysing the effects it had on the younger generation who had lived with segregation their entire lives. The sudden change in social dynamics is explored when the blacks and whites of a football team are forced to sit next to each other on a bus by the black coach Herman Boone. This scene serves as a great representation of the many changes taking place during desegregation. Up until this point, it was illegal for blacks to even have a seat on a bus, and suddenly they were sharing and sitting next to the whites.
Listen up, I don't care if you're black, green, blue, white, or orange. I want all of my defensive players on this side, all players going out for offense over here, right? Get comfortable, too, because the person that I have you sitting next to is the same one that you'll be rooming with for the duration of this camp.
Many of the whites were disgusted with the new laws that meant their old slaves were now being treated as equal to them. Although, on the other hand, the blacks were finding it hard to overcome and to come to terms with their new privileges. Overall, this scene represents a striking image of people from both races finally sitting on the same level. The film also offers further insight on the issue that the whites had many objections towards the new laws. This fact is brought to light later on in the film as the T.C. Williams Titans football team prepare for one of their final games of the season. During a pre-match interview with a local news station, the coach of the opposing team calls the Titans coach, Herman Boone, an ape. This blatant act of racism reminds the audience that even with the new laws that were meant to bring the blacks and whites closer together, the blacks were still not fully accepted within the white society and were still being pushed towards isolation. Instead of being brought down by these insults, Coach Boone holds his head high and is still able to lead his team to a win. This is symbolic of the determination and strength of the black community, and that they were not going to let their lives be controlled by the whites anymore. However, not all whites were like the opposing coach, and even though most of the whites hated the blacks during the beginning of desegregation, many grew to accept them as part of society, and this theme is best portrayed by the comparison of two scenes in the movie. At the start of the film, when Coach Boone first moves into a house in the white neighborhood, many whites are protesting outside his new house, waving their fists and shouting racist remarks. Although, by the end of the film, after Coach Boone has shown his true worth and won numerous football games, all of the whites are outside his house, cheering his name and congratulating him on his achievements. These scenes portray the change of heart that the whites went through as they began to finally accept the blacks in their society, and ultimately leading on to the culturally diverse American society of today. Overall, the film Remember the Titans does well to represent both the positive and the negative events that took place during the post-civil rights era. In retrospect, both of these texts offer many lessons on the trials that the blacks and whites went through during the civil rights era. The song All of the Places We've Been by Gil Scott-Heron reflects on the optimism, hope, and inspiration that was so vital to the persistence and survival of the African Americans. On the other hand, Remember the Titans explores the effects that the new laws of the post-civil rights era had on society. It reminds us that even with the dismantling of segregation, there was still so much objection to the laws by a significant number of whites. I believe that these films and songs offer great context to this time and period. They helped me to understand both sides of the story. These texts managed to be both intelligent and emotionally moving. As a nation, America overcame stereotypes, racism, and segregation to unite its people and become one of the strongest and most powerful countries in the world. Despite its current status as a free country, we can never forget its terrible history and the oppression and discrimination that the African Americans and the poor whites faced during the civil rights era. Thank you for listening to my podcast. I hope it gave you more understanding, knowledge, and context of the civil rights era in America. I hope you enjoyed.